So I guess while we're live, okay. Alright, so I guess while we're still live, I give two apologies. One, I'm sick and I'm losing my voice, and the second is I've had way too much freaking caffeine this morning, so I'm like wired. So if I talk too fast, just like those shit, I don't try to slow down. So hi, my name's Pachulski, and this is Brian Martin. So we're kind of taking a different approach because everyone's doing like the IT side, the network side, and of course the physical side is still severely lacking. It's still easier to just walk inside the building and like take shit and walk out because there's less controls and people are far easier to manipulate than it is to manipulate the network. At least from the physical side, because people are kind of gullible and it's far easier to exploit. Yeah, I'm just gonna like babble.
Is anybody here doing physical testing? Anybody doing physical testing?
So we have one guy. All right.
All right, thanks.
Yay.
It's not for you. Look.
So before we actually run into it, I want to thank Rob for. I want to thank Rob for putting this thing on, and Tenacity obviously for sponsoring it. All right, so running into it from the physical side, obviously the first thing we're concerned with is obviously, do we have a point for the test? It's kind of like network test, do we have a target? It's the first thing you should be asking, obviously, when we walk into the engagement, what is the point of doing this test? Do we actually have a point, or is it just you're testing for regulatory compliance, whether it's like PCI or HIPAA or NIST 853A, Red 3? But a lot of people still don't have an idea. They just want stuff tested and see if you can break in without a real point, which kind of lacks purpose to the test. Yeah.
So the important thing with your customers, every customer is different, and what makes sense in one physical test may not make sense in another. And a lot of times the customers don't understand themselves what it is that has value in their organization. For instance, if you're looking at an internet service provider, they think that their T-lines are the best, that's the target. They're worried about denial of service, they're worried about somebody snagging their customer info, but they're not paying attention to the check register that they've got on the desk by the window. And if you can get into their bank account, you can pretty much shut their business down, like we've seen in the news over the last year or two. So there's different targets inside the organization, and it's up to you as the professional tester to explain to the client what it is they need to be afraid of, what it is they need to be testing, unless they're after something specific and they're telling you what to do, which isn't always bad. But keep your eyes open even if you're working on a specific set of instructions. There's other things available.
Cool. All right, so going on with Brian, so how do we actually figure out what's important? I mean, the customer can say, this is what's important to us, and it may not actually be true, because a lot of times they don't actually understand the risks to their own organization, which is creepy in itself. And of course, you guys have your own definition of what's important because you want to pop shit. You just want to get boxes, you get room on boxes. That's not always critical to the organization. So how do you actually figure out what's actually important? I think one of the best guys who did this was actually down at BrewCon with Chris, and he actually said, how do you actually figure out what's important to the customer? So who can actually figure out, who can tell me what is actually important to the customer? What makes them function? How do you figure that out? I'll give you a sticker or someone can answer the question of like, what's actually important to the customer? What makes them run?
Money.
Okay, outside the money, how do you, based on the organization, what if they do like, they sell ice cream?
Formula to the ice cream.
Okay.
He's won enough already.
I mean,
Like
I was
a bank or something like the servers that you I'll be the main point.
okay.
What makes them money?
So how do you figure that out?
What kind of company are they?
Okay.
McDonald's, food.
Ask your question.
Ask the question. What actually makes your business run? And a lot of us, when we walk into it, we're just like, yeah, we're going to test shit, and we start testing stuff, and we haven't actually figured out what's actually important to the customer, what makes their business actually run. So starting there, figure out, ask them, what's important, what makes your business run? Go through your standard social profiling, hit Google, hit FOCA, go through your bullshit and figure out who are the important people, what's the critical assets to the company. And that's what you should base your test around. And a lot of times the customers don't understand that, so you have to be able to communicate that in an effective manner on their level. Explain this is what's actually important from our perspective, and let's kind of differentiate this or compare this with what you think is important. From there, come up with based on what we're actually going to test.
So one of the other things that you need to be aware of when you're prepping physical testing is the type of physical test, but you need to be asking important questions. If you're going in a covert test, and this is more important in Pennsylvania and related territories that have strange gun laws, if you're going in covert, it's not just the security guards that you need to be aware of. You need to be asking the client intelligent questions like, what's your policy on concealed carry in the workplace? Do you have one? If you don't have one, have you had any incidents here that might make people nervous when I come in at 2 a.m.? And if they are, you may want to reconsider doing a late night physical surprise test because you might get popped, literally. And that's not something, it's not getting pinched by the cops and spending the night in jail, it's getting shot at. Just came up as a topic in a recent test. So be aware that there are other things besides the locks that you need to be concerned with.
All right. So after you define all that, obviously defining what kind of test you're actually doing. Are we going in as a covert test? Are we going in as a force test? Force meaning we can actually break shit to get into the building if we need to. Break stuff to get into the rooms where the interesting stuff is actually being stored. For all the servers that we're targeting, because we've learned that they have a central database server sitting in a locked room with drop ceilings. We know where it is. Can we break stuff to actually get into that room? Can we just fall to the ceiling, knock out a portion of the wall to get in there, grab the server and walk out? Next. All right. Sort of what's the overall point of doing the physical tests? It's kind of a line again with the standard network test. We want to determine the attack vectors. We want to evaluate all the controls that are already in place. Flip side is we're evaluating physically. We're looking at are the alarm systems that are in place actually functioning as expected? Are they implemented in the correct places? Do you have motion sensors set up in really ridiculous spots? Are they actually being effective? Are they pointed in correctly? If they're pointing down the hallway, they're pointing down the hallway but at a wall at an angle you could walk along the wall and not be detected.
A lot of times if you're going up to a client that's never had this done at all, they will be so out of shape that it's not even worth your time to do a genuine pen test, and you just need to do basically a security walkthrough and review with them. It's unbelievable how many people have door open sensors and they've never tested them, glass break sensors, they've never tested them, they don't know if they work, they may have gone off accidentally one time but they don't know why. Door locks that they're not certain stay locked or unlocked as appropriate. Cameras that are not functioning, cameras that are not looked at all the time. Every piece of security apparatus that they have implemented to make their place more secure, they've never validated. So the first time you go in, it may not be a question of when am I coming back to pop your locks. It may be a question of sitting down and walking through their entire apparatus and getting them back onto some sort of track before you can actually do a valid test.
So obviously, as part of the physical test, at some point you're going to engage a person, whether you expect it to or not. You're actually going to have to bump into someone because it usually happens, and it's usually when you're walking out the door with something in your hands. So you have to be able to actually include that SE part. And as part of the physical pen testing, you need to be able to come up with interesting stories on the fly that kind of make sense. You need to be able to sell it effectively to the person who's going to be questioning you why you're walking out of the door with insert interesting piece of equipment here. So you kind of need to be able to think on your feet, come up with good stories. Hopefully, before you actually begin the engagement, you actually come up with some kind of pretext as far as this is who I am, what I'm doing. This is why I'm walking out of your building with interesting shit. So having all that stuff kind of planned out beforehand is good, but if it kind of flakes halfway through the engagement, you need to be able to start thinking on your feet and learn kind of how to manipulate people based on where you are and the type of person you're actually engaging in. Because a lot of times it'll be security guards that will be stopping you. Other times it'll be actual personnel who are trained to engage with questionable people walking through the building. And while it's easier to manipulate normal employees because they're kind of scared most of the time to actually engage with people because it's not their job, they'll just kind of do the rudimentary, hi, who are you? That's an easy one to get out of, but the armed security guard who's been trained to stop, engage, and deter from leaving the facility is quite harder to manipulate. Well, not harder, but it takes a little more skill.
So most of us should know by now that if we really want to get into something, it's just a question of time and money. Clients don't want us to take forever to get in, but the reality is that the threats that they're up against may have unlimited funds, may have unlimited resources. One of the best services that you can bring to your client is figuring out what real threats are to their organization. If they're a dry cleaner in Allentown, Pennsylvania, the Mossad is not really a threat. But if they're a data center housing some DoD stuff, maybe housing some Mid-Eastern security stuff, then stranger threats, more exotic threats become realistic, and you get to spend more money on the pen test.
So at this point, you've landed your first case. Huh? Yeah, break shit. So there's a bunch of different methodologies out there to actually perform the tests. Some of them are well known. Yeah, we can do this. We're going ahead. All right. So as part of the engagement, I jumped ahead like 2 slides. Way too much checking this one. Discussing with the customer what you're actually allowed to do as you're starting the test. There have to be kind of like the rules of engagement with the pen test. You're saying this is what you're allowed to do between these time frames. You're allowed to perform these actions. Blah blah blah. Of course, on the physical side, it can get a little more interesting because you're obviously physically entering the facility. So there needs to be a well-defined guideline. If you don't have a well-defined guideline and it's left wide open, they pretty much say you can do whatever the hell you want to do. That leaves that leaves some interesting room for us as far as not only profiling the facility, but profiling individual employees, because it's also far easier to profile an individual, track an individual, develop a nice little background as far as where the person goes, what time they leave work, where they live, how many kids they have, how many cars, dogs, pets, and actually leveraging your pen test against that person to get into the facility. So scope has to be well defined. It can't just be, you can do this from like 8 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the following morning and go have fun. So the actual, what you plan on doing has to be well defined. So are you allowed to break shit? Are you allowed to alter stuff to make it more difficult for security forces to see what you're doing? Are you allowed to like loop cameras? Can you disable alarm systems?
And one of the most important, one of my favorites is, are you allowed to social engineer people? And if you are allowed to social engineer people, are you allowed to be evil about it? And that's one, Adrian, come on. That's one where I have only ever used it in extreme security circumstances when things like really, really big, expensive stuff is on the line. Because if you're going to emotionally traumatize a person so that you can succeed with a pen test, everybody involved needs to be comfortable with that fact that potentially you're going to damage another human being. It's not a fun thought. I highly recommend that you don't resort to things like that on lower-level pen tests. You resort to that from the extremes. Lying to people makes people feel bad. And if they know that they're the source of the penetration into the system, they're going to feel even worse. And in some cases, they get fired. A failure in security is a failure in security. You can't just have that security guard come back and go, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. He's got to go find a new job someplace. So it's potentially bad. Be careful with it.
Especially true when you're scoping out what you're allowed to do. Because a lot of times it's we target individual employees because it's far easier to just go after one person who's in a critical position. And it's not too hard to figure out, especially since most companies are happy to put major executives' names up on the websites and say, so-and-so is the CTO, so-and-so is the CFO. From there, building your profile, figuring out, where they're actually based at, sitting inside the building waiting for the guy whose picture's on the website to actually walk out the door, follow him home, and start profiling, eventually figure out, these are interesting things that he does, and actually waging your pen test against that person.
Once you have the scope, it's a lot of fun.
So there's a couple different methodologies. Some of them I'm sure you guys have heard of. The first one is the OSSTM. What's interesting about this is there's always been a big segregation between the physical side and the network side. We were pretty much very different sides of the houses. The IT guys did their stuff and physical security guys did their stuff. But recently it's obviously been merging together where the security guys are the security guys. We're now responsible for the network side of the house, and we're responsible for the physical side of the house.
Part of what drives that is that you've only got a limited time frame to work with the client. So if they only want to spend a week's worth of money, and you've got to get in and be successful, it may not be possible for you to go in and do it electronically within a week. They may be a very hardened facility, but it might be really easy to go in and grab a laptop. That you can do in a day or less. So it gives us options when we're talking about pen testing as a whole, not just physical, not just electronic.
Of course, the people, and some of us in particular, like to leave our stuff laying in the car when we like run into 7-Eleven or Starbucks to get coffee. So it's a couple different methodologies, some for testing, some for actually design and
Did you lose a
testing.
laptop recently?
No.
Where that came from?
If I did, I would admit it anyway. All right, so the OSS TMM, Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual, they have a good framework for actually doing the whole network side as well as the physical side. Goes to pretty much step-by-step what you need to be looking at, assessing the perimeter, documenting controls. So if you haven't seen that, take a look at it. The link's up there. Yeah, wrong shit. Crime prevention through environmental design is another design and assessment methodology. It was used for designing the perimeter, assessing the perimeter, how to define your perimeter, how to use like bushes and stuff to keep people from looking into your facility, how to use fencing, how to use...
Don't put trees in front of your cameras.
Yeah, don't put trees in front of your cameras, or don't put trees next to your building, which we'll show later on. Wait, there's one more there. It was in the notes. And another one that people are starting to use now is the NIST SP500-53A Rev 3, which is going through PE controls as far as how to assess your physical environment. So that's another popular one to use.
But anybody who's going to do real testing is, this is not something that you want to work on. It's a good reference document.
Right. All right. So what are we actually concerned with? As we want to document, we'll try to explain to the customer what the actual threats are. And based on the type of environment that you're at, the location, there's a bunch of different threats. If you're working in a really crappy part of town, obviously you have these spontaneous thieves. Usually like crackheads walking by the building, see cool stuff in the window, want to steal stuff. Low-level threats, pilfers, thieves, demonstrators. Then we get into the internal employees, where of course, as of now, they're the greatest source of breaches. It was like 80%, I think the last guy said. Yeah. So we're actually concerned with detailing that, how to exploit the internal employees to get what we want, whether it's information or physical stuff to bring back to the customer. Your criminals, espionage, and of course the terrorists, which unless you're like Gov or a very public-facing entity, you're not really too concerned with the terrorists. But it is a vector you have to address, especially if you're dealing with high-level customers, how the bad guys can wage war against your facility.
Yeah, it just requires a real creative bent on your part, because while you've got a limited time, you've got limited experience, these guys, the bad guys, have a lot of time on their hands to think about how they do this stuff, and they trade information in internal networks. It may be really fun to pop a network using the proper tools and maybe some emails and a couple of different exploits. But if I can just walk up to an employee and go, here's $100, what's your login and ID, or login and password, and get in that way, that's A, quicker, more cost-effective, and I think just as much fun. But you've got to think creative like that when you're doing these testing, because these guys have a stellar imagination. Humans, maybe we're the cleverest monkeys on the planet. We can get into anything. It's just a matter of intent. So you as a tester, or you as somebody who's trying to get into something, you've got to have that intent, that drive to get in. These guys have motivations that put mine as just a dude earning a paycheck to shame. They want to get in for political reasons. They want to get in for personal reasons. Nothing's more motivated than an addict that needs a fix. They'll get into just about anything.
One of the interesting ones we talked about down at Chicon, for the internal employees, down in Atlanta, they had this really cool system where if you want to get a ride to work, you go into this little system down there and you punch in your name and your address and where you work and what time you start working, and they'll kind of match you up with other people, so you can actually develop profiles of who works where and what time they start work. So it's actually a good way to figure it out. We're going to try to play with it, but they didn't, because...
What was Wick's title for that? It was like Hacking Green, Eco-Friendly Cyber Stalking?
Yes. We were going to use it for purposes like stalking girls. Or he was, not me. But yeah, as far as figuring out specific companies, who works somewhere, and again, targeting those individual employees, developing a relationship with them by, hitching a ride to work with them. Eventually, working your magic and having them actually show you around the facility to the point where you can just start walking around because you're so well known. Depending on the time frame of your test, if you have infinite amount of time, you can goof with it for a while. If you're under time constraints, obviously, you have to develop relationships with those people relatively quickly. But that's another venue that we were looking at as far as leveraging the internal employee. And a lot of the cities have that. I know even down by me in DC, they have the same system where they have the slug line thing. You can go up there, you punch your name in, and they try to match up with people who tell you where to catch rides with certain people. So another way we're looking at trying to get into some interesting blah, blah, blahs down there.
Audience participation. Audience participation moment. Can anybody explain to me psychologically the difference between a lock and a camera?
People are comfortable with that.
That's good. What was the other one? Yes, one prevents and one detects. One of them will actually stop you from getting into something, at least temporarily. But the other does nothing except in your mind. So is it really a security device? Only if someone's looking at it.
Which we have interesting pictures of there.
Crazy.
Two methodology pretty much the same. We're going to run through real quick. Research, recon, plan, execute, extract, which is of course a different one from the network side and the wrap-up or reporting. So in the research, I mean, these are a couple of interesting pictures. So I was
How many ninjas can you see in that picture?
So for assessing the
27.
external perimeter and seeing how we can get into it, I mean, picture on the left is obviously, it's a nice barrier, prevents us from seeing the actual facility behind it, because of the way they designed the fencing, which looks nice, and it isn't like a nasty chain link fence, there's like barbed wire on top of it. But the trees directly growing behind it, provides the physical barrier from actually us driving by it and actually see what's there. So it's actually a pretty good design, so I want to put that one in there. So props to them, even though fences are useless, and it takes 45 seconds typically to get by any fence, whether it's barbed wire or not. It's not meant to be an actual definitive barrier, it's just kind of prevents you from moving into the perimeter.
But it also prevents them from seeing you coming.
Right. So the second one, lighting is important. Because obviously if we're on the inside looking out at the perimeter, we want to be able to see if someone's actually coming to us. We also want to be able to see out. So this is really horrible lighting. If anyone's ever heard of the fishbowl effect, if you light up the entire inside of the inside of the facility, and it's completely dark outside, you can't see shit. So while it looks cool from an artist's point of view, it's pretty useless. So you can pretty much walk up to the house and they won't even see that you're there. But anyway, it looks nice in a picture. So I was driving home one day. I just moved out into the Virginia area, and I just happened to catch out of the corner of my eye this like gray top over like this black wrought iron fence with ivy growing up it. It was actually really good design because I didn't actually see any of this. Because I usually drive by like there. So I actually turned around one day and tried to get into the little road there and couldn't because it had a big old fence with bollards behind it, so you couldn't drive in there. So I had to drive around back. Anyway, the point of this was you couldn't actually see this house. It was so well covered that you couldn't see anything. So after I drove around, I woke up to the door. I kind of like hopped the fence and woke up there and asked the guy to take pictures of his house because I thought it was a really good layout, whoever designed the landscaping and used it in a presentation is doing, to which he asked me to leave the property. And I didn't take any pictures, but so I resorted to the next best thing, Google. So when you're casing places for your jobs, and if you can't actually, for whatever reason, get close to it because you don't want to make your presence known, Google is your friend. This is actually a nice overhead for how I want to plan to get into it. Not that I'm going to break into this, because it's like 10 minutes from where I live. But obviously, how they designed this thing, this is why it was important that I wanted to take a picture outside the backyard, which is really bad design. The whole front is wide open. The perimeter is well defined with an 8-foot wrought iron fence with ivy growing up it. So you can't actually see anything if you're walking up to it. It's just a wall of green crap with like black stuff sticking out of it. And as far as I actually did hop the fence, which wasn't too hard. Again, it took a couple of seconds just to flip over it. The perimeter is wide open. Actually at night, it's actually well lit. They have lights on the house pointing outward so they can see everything. And it's kind of hard to see if you're walking up to it because the way the lights are laid out, it's kind of like a blinding effect. So this is actually a really good layout, but of course Google gave me the whole map of how, if I actually want to break into this house, how I can get into it. The only bad side was this is their, this is a pool. So they actually have their inside pool with, the only bad part is if you walk around here, there's another road here, and you guys walk particularly to the back of the house and into the pool room, we kind of like walking that way if you really wanted to. Yes. All right.
Pretty diagram.
Yes.
Okay.
That was important. So good touch brings to defense. To a common methodology used to define physical security. You build layers. How we define build on networks.
When someone passes this ring, something happens. When someone passes this ring, something happens.
Right.
When someone passes this ring, something happens. So what do? We redefine what we're going to do. We think outside the box. We just attack here first. And now all that preparation is useless.
If you properly design concentric rings, defense will hopefully detect and deter as you get deeper into each layer. Other example is, of course, the Pentagon Air Force. It was actually really good design. Each layer kind of compacts on the other. Take out one layer, stuff into another layer. Using a good example, I guess, not that it's good, but when the bad guys flew a plane into the building, obviously you only got through one layer and the rest of the building was still okay. It was actually a really good design because you had to break through multiple layers to actually get to the core where the really, really interesting stuff is at. Not that I know that firsthand, but...
Or the CIA may take it.
So, before I get into this little thing, this is actual, like, why the physical security side is important. So this company here, just to proceed, these aren't my pictures, I didn't do this. The company here had a physical security assessment come in from an external company. They kind of looked through the whole facility and they said you need cameras and stuff throughout the building, and that's pretty much all they sold them on was you need an alarm system and you need cameras. So the people who own this facility said, okay, so we bought an alarm system, we bought some cameras. So from the outside of this building, that was pretty much the view. You could see into the office, you could see the layout, drop ceilings, where everything's located. The other great thing was around the external perimeter, they had these really cool bushes that you could pretty much walk up, literally. You can climb up the bushes and get onto the roof. You can see here, this is the bush outside. At the top of each one of these little bush columns, there were air conditioner condensers. So you climb up the bush, you grab onto the condenser, pull yourself up onto the roof. They didn't take this into the assessment saying, you should remove these things because you can climb up the building and get on the roof and do malicious things. Of course, most people who look at the physical security stuff don't take into account that rooftop entries are the easiest and most looked upon point of entry into buildings. So after they got on the roof, they couldn't find some way to get in, so they decided to make themselves some holes in the roof to actually get into the building. They cut a total of 6 holes into the ceiling. So when they came in, there were actually 6 of these monstrous holes in the ceiling of this place. The guys kind of cut the holes and repelled into the building.
Normally you don't want to do that.
But it was
Probably
cool.
a hole there that you can use.
So a couple things, obviously. When you're doing the assessments, always look at the roof. The roof is the easiest way in because no one thinks to look up for whatever reason. Don't know why. The roof is the least secure place of the building, typically. So when you're building your security, build something at the roof, motion sensors, something. And when you go with these outsourced companies to manage your security, make sure someone's actually watching this stuff. So in this example here, when the guys actually cut the holes in the ceiling and then repelled into the building and walked up to the alarm system and then cut the camera wire, they cut the actual wires from the CCTV and they ripped the alarm panel off the wall. The security company called the owner of the facility and said, there's an error with your alarm system. Would you like us to transfer you to tech support, or would you like to look at it in the morning? So the owner of the place said, well, I'll just look at it in the morning. Don't worry about it. This is what it came into in the morning. This was 6 inches of concrete, around 4 inches of steel. So after they got in there, they had the entire night to hack away through concrete and set on the torch, cut the safe open.
Look, you can see that they were using a nice saw. If you've got the time, anything can be broken.
So what actually happens if you get made while you're doing these things? Say you actually broke into a building, repelled in, and spend all night hacking away at concrete, and actually cut the safe open, and you're walking out the front door with cool stuff, and someone stops you. First thing, obviously important, your get out of jail free card.
This is the one from my last job.
Yes.
It's still kind of in my pocket. Just a couple days ago.
You
Must
should
have one of these.
Yes, always keep it with you. It should be on company letterhead with contact information, preferably of the owner of the company. So if you get busted and you can't talk your way out of it, you can at least say, okay, this person authorized me to be here. Please call them.
Keep multiple copies.
Especially if you're walking through water surrounding something and you fall on your ass and you have your back pocket, which I've done, and it kind of gets all messed up and you can't actually justify why you're there, and then you spend the night in jail. Spending the night in jail sucks, by the way. So when you get to the actual reporting phase, it's just like any other reporting. You want to report on what the actual scope was in its entirety, whether you succeeded or failed. All the issues that you discovered during the entire process. Were you able to get into this? Were you able to get into that? Were you not able to get into this? Why? The other thing to keep in mind is don't bullshit. It's not good for us. While it may make you look better, try to keep it true to the facts only.
Yeah, a lot of people are willing to collect a paycheck, but the fact of the matter is you're there to help the client, and if what you're providing the client isn't going to help them that much, if all you've done is pop a lock and say, oh, you need a different lock, that hasn't really fully assessed their security situation. You're there for the client. You've got to be doing a good job for them, or you're probably not going to be doing this as a job for long.
And as you're going through that, you're obviously going to be basing a lot of it on what the risk level is against the facility. Typically what they use is the model facility versus current facility. It's kind of like doing a gap analysis, saying based on your current facility, if you should have these controls, this is what we recommend as your best case scenario, as opposed to what you're at now, and present that with all your recommendations, just to make it look professional and you actually did something useful rather than just break shit. And obviously methodology is important when they start going through saying, what did you do and how did you do it, can we repeat it again. Keep the process defined, just like any other kind of testing. Recommended reading, EA, OSSTM, prevention, DoD manuals, Marine Corps manuals, and a couple Army manuals. Good reading. If you haven't done any physical stuff, it's a good starting point.
Exotic Liability Podcast.
Yes, Chris Nickerson. Haven't seen his room come talk, I've recommend you listen to it. A couple of commercial training facilities, as is EPI. They're at Virginia, I think both are in Virginia.
Go back a second. If you're in the business and you're looking to make some good industry contacts to generate sales, things like ACES are a gold mine. The people that participate in those a lot of times have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and when you tell them, they're like, oh, you've got to come over to my facility, here's a contract. So you do want to participate in these industry things. You have to work on it, but other than that.
Most of the time. Anything else sums it up? Yeah. And I'm not allowed to say that
So,
before.
trivia question for the last t-shirt I got my hands to give away. Is everybody relatively familiar with a 5-position button cipher lock?
Yep.
It's got 5 buttons, combo. If there are 4 digits used for the combination, how many possible combos are there? None of the people from last night can answer this. I've talked about this. How many combos? 4 out of 5. Seems like a lot, right? Must be a bunch. What was that? 24. How long will it take you to go through those? About a minute. So those locks suck.
I got a pet project idea I need to talk to you about. Take an Arduino, take some kind of movable frame you can use little servo motors and have it programmatically either press buttons or switch knobs through all the possible combinations of something. Then you can do it even faster. I haven't figured out a good way to put that on a frame, though, that's easily mountable on top of the average.
What's with you and mounting things? It's just boring.
I'm lonely.
Yeah. 3 digits doesn't help. And the way that you figure out which 4 they used is, of course, well,
Look at the worn buttons.
no, they don't wear. They're made out of metal. It's easier. Baby powder, dusting. I was going for fingerprinting, but I'll take any kind of powder.
You'll take any kind of powder? What?
Yeah.
Okay, graphite powder is your friend. Keep it in your bag. And we're done.
No questions? All right, we're around.